MDV Nasser asks, did a young schoolboy really find a lost Mayan city or just a few?
In 2025, scientists did something no one had ever done before. They cracked open the DNA of the ancient Maya. What they found wasn't just shocking. It changed everything we thought we knew about Copan's rise, its collapse, and the people who lived and died there. From elite rulers to human sacrifices, from drought to rebellion, the truth was buried deep in their bones. And now, for the first time, we can finally read it. Let's discover what happened to Copan. For over 1,000 years, the ancient city of Copan lay silent, its royal tombs sealed, its plazas empty, its pyramids slowly being swallowed by jungle. Once alive with ritual, music, and the movement of thousands, this city in modern-day Honduras became little more than ruins buried beneath dirt and time. But in its prime, Copan wasn't just a city. It was a powerhouse of the ancient Maya world. It produced mind-bending calendars, mind-blowing architecture, and a royal dynasty that ruled for nearly 4 centuries. And yet, around the year 820, everything stopped. The buildings ceased, the rituals halted, the people vanished. What made this thriving civilization collapse so suddenly? Why did the elite vanish? Why did one of the most advanced societies in the Americas crumble almost overnight? Copan was one of the crown jewels of the classic Maya period, which lasted from roughly 250 to 950. This era marked the height of Maya political power, urban expansion, and intellectual achievements across Mesoamerica. During these centuries, the Maya were not just building cities, they were building astronomical observatories, crafting complex hieroglyphic scripts, and creating advanced calendars that tracked time across thousands of years. Copan, located near the southeastern edge of the Maya world, was one of the most dazzling of these city-states. Strategically placed near trade routes connecting Central and South America, it became a hub of political influence, religious authority, and artistic brilliance. Its monuments still speak volumes. The city's iconic hieroglyphic stairway, carved with over 2,000 individual glyphs, is the longest-known Maya inscription and recounts the story of its rulers in remarkable detail. Its sculptures, stelae, and temples are considered some of the most intricate and refined in all of Maya civilization. Copan wasn't just powerful, it was cultured, sophisticated, and deeply spiritual. And its dynastic line, said to have begun with an outsider king named Kinich Yaxcook Mo in 426, held power across 16 rulers for nearly 400 years. So why did it all come crashing down? This is where the mystery deepens. The collapse of Copan wasn't isolated. Around the same period, many other major Maya cities, including Palenque, Tikal, and Calakmul, also experienced rapid decline. But what made Copan's case especially puzzling was how suddenly and completely it fell. The construction of major temples stopped. Political inscriptions disappeared. Elite tombs ceased to be filled, and there were no clear signs of violent conquest, invasion, or mass slaughter. No burnt cities, no destroyed temples, no mass graves. It was as if the civilization simply gave up. For decades, scholars have tried to piece together what caused this unraveling. Some pointed to environmental stress. Deforestation and soil depletion, they argued, may have pushed agriculture to its limits, leading to famine and abandonment. Others highlighted the role of drought. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the 9th century saw some of the most severe dry periods in Maya history, potentially devastating maize crops and destabilizing food supply. Still others pointed to internal issues, overpopulation, increasing social inequality between the elites and the commoners, and the rising costs of maintaining lavish rituals, monuments, and warfare. Yet, despite decades of study, no single theory fully explained what happened in Copan. The evidence was either too scattered, too localized, or too circumstantial. What if the real clues to Copan's collapse weren't in its ruins, but inside the people themselves? In 2025, scientists did something never done before. They sequenced DNA from ancient burials, unlocking information that had been sealed for over 1,000 years. These genomes revealed patterns of ancestry, movement, and social divide that no artifact ever could. It wasn't just about who lived in Copan, but how they lived, and how their world began to unravel from within. What they found rewrote history and raised unsettling new questions. Because buried in that data was something no one expected: decoding DNA from the dead. Imagine being able to read someone's history, not from a scroll or stone carving, but from inside their bones, learning where they came from, what population they belonged to, who they were related to, and even where they might have spent their childhood. That's exactly what scientists are doing today using ancient DNA. And in 2025, they used this method to analyze human remains buried over 1,000 years ago in Copan. It's a new kind of archaeology, one that doesn't just uncover the structures and artifacts a civilization left behind, but the people themselves on a molecular level. But how exactly do you extract genetic material from someone who lived more than a millennium ago? And what can that DNA really tell us about the collapse of an entire civilization? The process begins with a search for the right kind of bone. Not all bones preserve DNA equally. In fact, most skeletal remains from hot, humid places like Central America are severely degraded after hundreds of years. But scientists have found that one part of the body is especially good at locking in ancient DNA: the petrous part of the temporal bone. This is a dense portion of the skull, located near the inner ear, and it's known for being one of the most durable bones in the human body. Even after centuries underground, the petrous bone can still protect fragments of DNA from environmental damage, microbial contamination, and the passage of time. Using specialized tools and clean lab environments, researchers carefully drilled into this bone, collected powder samples, and used a method called next-generation sequencing to isolate and read the remaining genetic material. This is how scientists working at Copan were able to successfully extract and analyze complete genomes from 7 individuals buried during the city's classic period peak. These weren't random burials. The people selected for sampling came from different types of graves, representing different roles in society, different biological lineages, and possibly even different geographic origins. Together, they offered a small but incredibly valuable cross-section of Copan's ancient population, revealing who lived there, who ruled there, and who might have been sacrificed there. 2 individuals in particular stood out. The first, labeled CPM-13, was discovered in an elaborate tomb just outside the city's royal acropolis. This person had been buried with grave goods, jade beads, fine ceramics, and other high-status offerings. The tomb's construction, location, and contents suggested that CPM-13 had been a member of the elite, possibly even related to the ruling dynasty that had governed Copan for centuries. The second individual, CPM-12, was buried nearby, but in a very different fashion. His body had been laid out in a pose typically associated with ritual sacrifice. There were no rich offerings, no ornate architecture. The nature of his burial suggested that he might have been offered to the gods or sacrificed as part of a political or religious event. But then came the surprise. When scientists analyzed the DNA from both men, they discovered that CPM-13 and CPM-12 shared the same Y chromosome lineage. This is a genetic signature passed down through the male line, from father to son, and it acts almost like a biological surname. Today, the Q1b lineage is still common among many indigenous populations across the Americas, and its presence in both individuals tells us that their male ancestors came from the same ancient genetic branch. But the two men were not close relatives, not brothers, not father and son. This was confirmed through genome-wide comparison, which showed no close familial connection beyond that shared male ancestry. In other words, they belonged to the same broader population but had followed very different life paths, one rising to the top of society, the other ending in sacrifice. This is where ancient DNA does something that archaeology alone cannot. It maps not just the social or ritual roles of individuals, but their biological identities. While inscriptions and artifacts tell us what people did, genetics tells us who they were, where their families came from, how they were connected to others, and how their lives might have been shaped by deep ancestral roots or more recent migrations. The maternal side of the story was just as revealing. Scientists also sequenced mitochondrial DNA from the 7 individuals. Unlike the Y chromosome, which is only passed from father to son, mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child and can be used to trace maternal ancestry. Among the individuals analyzed, researchers found 2 main maternal haplogroups, A2 and C1. These are both ancient lineages that originated in the Americas thousands of years ago and are still common today across a wide range of indigenous communities from Alaska to Argentina. Their presence in Copan shows that the city's population included women from genetically diverse backgrounds. This diversity suggests that Copan was not a closed or isolated society. People, especially women, were likely moving between regions, marrying into new communities, and helping to weave together different lineages across the Maya world. And while these may seem like abstract genetic labels, they actually point to very real social and historical processes. A high frequency of mitochondrial diversity suggests that women may have migrated into Copan from different regions, perhaps as part of alliances, marriages, or trade relationships. This kind of movement adds new context to what we know from archaeology, that Copan was a cosmopolitan city, deeply connected to other urban centers like Teotihuacan in central Mexico and Tikal in Guatemala. But it also means that when crisis came, whether from environmental collapse, political instability, or internal unrest, it impacted a genetically and socially complex population. The society that fell wasn't monolithic. It was made up of people from different places, carrying different histories, who had come together in one city, and eventually shared the same fate. Section 3. A City on the Rise. The story of Copan's collapse becomes even more compelling when we understand just how far it had risen. This wasn't an isolated village that quietly faded into obscurity. It was a political and cultural powerhouse, and its rapid growth over several centuries makes its downfall all the more shocking. Copan's origins can be traced back to 426 AD, when the city's first major ruler, Kiinich Yaxcook Mo, arrived. But here's the mystery. He wasn't from Copan. In fact, everything about him, his burial, his skeletal features, even his name, suggests he came from outside the region, possibly central Mexico. His arrival marked a turning point in Copan's history, the beginning of a dynasty that would rule for nearly 400 years and shape every major aspect of the city's identity. Who exactly was Kiinich Yaxcook Mo? Archaeologists believe he may have come from the city of Tikal, or even Teotihuacan, one of the great power centers of Mesoamerica at the time. His skeleton revealed physical modifications such as reshaped teeth and cranial deformation, consistent with central Mexican elite traditions, not local ones. This suggests he wasn't just an outsider, but someone trained and raised in a different cultural and political environment. His arrival in Copan likely wasn't a coincidence. It may have been part of a deliberate political strategy, either to establish influence over new territory or to form alliances with emerging regional powers. The dynasty he founded, would go on to produce 16 known rulers, many of whom were buried in Copan's most sacred and architecturally elaborate spaces. But recent DNA analysis and isotopic testing add an entirely new layer to this origin story. Scientists studying the remains of elite individuals found evidence of genetic markers that trace back to highland Mexico, particularly regions associated with Zapotec-like populations. This ancestry made up about 6% of the Copan genomes analyzed, suggesting that while the majority of the population had local Maya roots, there was a noticeable influx of foreign genetic influence, especially among the ruling elite. This genetic blending was not accidental. It likely reflects intermarriage, political integration, and elite mobility across vast distances, a strategy used by many ancient states to strengthen alliances and secure regional stability. Isotopic analysis of tooth enamel, an advanced technique that measures chemical signatures based on where a person grew up, confirmed that several elites were not born in Copan. The foods people eat during childhood leave trace elements in their teeth, and by analyzing these isotopes, researchers can estimate where someone spent their early years. In Copan's case, many of the high-status individuals, including rulers, showed signatures consistent with Central Mexican diets, meaning they were raised outside Copan and only moved there later in life. This aligns with the theory that elite individuals were being brought in, either through political marriages, formal appointments, or ceremonial placements, to reinforce Copan's ties to distant power centers. These findings completely shift the narrative. Copan wasn't just a local capital growing in isolation, it was part of a much broader political and economic network that stretched across Mesoamerica. The city's rise involved strategic migration, cultural borrowing, and long-distance connections that allowed it to thrive as both a spiritual and administrative hub. And while the foreign ancestry made up a small percentage of the overall genetic makeup, its presence among the elite suggests it played a significant role in shaping how the city operated and interacted with the outside world. By the year 730, Copan's population had grown dramatically. Genetic data shows that the effective population size, the number of individuals contributing to the next generation's gene pool, had reached around 19,000. This is not the total population, which would have been larger, but a key measure of how big and stable the breeding population was. This explosive growth wasn't random. It was supported by innovations in food production, labor organization, and urban planning. At the center of it all was maize. Maize wasn't just a staple crop. It was the backbone of Copan's economy, religion, and social organization. The Maya believed that humans were created from maize, and this belief was reflected in their myths, ceremonies, and daily life. Copan's fields were engineered to grow vast quantities of it, supporting large populations and allowing people to specialize in other roles: priests, artisans, scribes, astronomers, and builders. Surplus maize meant that the city could maintain standing labor forces, build monumental architecture, and sustain political elites who governed full-time. The art and architecture from this period reflect a city that was confident, well-fed, and intellectually ambitious. The sculptures from Copan are some of the most detailed and refined in the Maya world, depicting kings dressed as gods, warriors locked in combat, and cosmological events rendered in stone. The city's stelae, tall monuments inscribed with dates and historical records, preserve detailed accounts of royal successions, military victories, and religious rituals. Copan's artisans also developed a highly stylized script that combined hieroglyphs and iconography, allowing them to record history, ideology, and cosmic cycles in ways few ancient civilizations ever matched. Astronomy also played a central role. Copan's buildings were aligned with celestial events, equinoxes, solstices, and planetary cycles. This wasn't just for show. Maya rulers used these alignments to schedule agricultural cycles, predict solar eclipses, and perform state rituals at moments of cosmic significance. In doing so, they reinforced their divine right to rule, linking their leadership directly to the movements of the heavens. The precision of their astronomical calculations continues to amaze scientists today. So how does this all tie together? The city that rose out of the Copan Valley was not a passive product of its environment. It was a carefully constructed, highly adaptive system that blended local traditions with foreign influences. Its population grew through both internal reproduction and external migration. Its rulers came from different places, brought different genes, and reshaped the city's politics. Its economy was rooted in a crop that was both sacred and strategic, and its intellectual life, expressed through writing, art, and astronomy, was designed to project power, stability, and divine order. But if this all sounds too perfect, that's because it was. As Copan expanded its influence and its population, the very systems that sustained it began to strain under their own weight. The elite networks that once stabilized the city could later become points of conflict. The reliance on maize would leave it vulnerable to environmental stress, and the rapid urban growth might have stretched resources thin. We now know that the seeds of collapse often appear at the very height of success. In Copan's case, the genetic record shows a thriving, blended, and highly mobile society, but one that, within just a few generations, would begin to fracture. Seeds of collapse. At its height, Copan was thriving. The city was filled with towering monuments, skilled artisans, elite astronomers, and thousands of people supported by intensive agriculture. But the very success that helped Copan rise also set it up for collapse. As the population swelled to nearly 19,000 effective individuals by the early 8th century, meaning even more in total population, so did the pressure on the land. Copan was located in a fertile valley, but even rich soil has limits. As demands on the agricultural system increased, the Maya began to push the land harder, clearing more forests, expanding into marginal areas, and intensifying maize cultivation. What started as innovation soon crossed into overuse, and over time, the land began to break down. How much maize can a valley produce before it begins to collapse under the weight of its own success? That question, in many ways, defined the final chapters of Copan's history. The Maya didn't just rely on maize for food. It was the foundation of their society. It shaped their economy, religion, and political power. But to feed a growing city, they had to clear enormous areas of forest to make way for fields. This widespread deforestation disrupted natural ecosystems, reduced soil stability, and made the landscape more vulnerable to erosion. As the protective tree cover vanished, rainfall carried away topsoil, reducing fertility and forcing farmers to expand even further into new, less productive areas. Archaeological surveys show evidence of ancient farming terraces on steep hillsides, which may have been last-ditch efforts to extract yields from increasingly depleted land. The result was a fragile system, increasingly unable to support the population that depended on it. And when environmental conditions began to change, that fragility became a crisis. From around the mid-9th century onward, a series of prolonged droughts struck the region. We know this not from written records, but from the science of paleoclimatology. By analyzing tree rings, lake sediment cores, and cave minerals, researchers have reconstructed rainfall patterns going back thousands of years. These records show that the period between the 9th and 11th centuries saw some of the driest conditions in Mesoamerican history. Crops failed, water supplies dwindled, and in a society so deeply tied to the land and its cycles, That kind of shock could unravel everything. The archaeological record from Copan during this time confirms that something went very wrong. By 750, population levels began to decline. Building activity slowed. Grand construction projects halted. By 820, the dynastic line came to an end. Inscriptions stopped appearing on stelae. The once thriving plazas grew silent. The city didn't fall in a single dramatic event, but gradually and then suddenly. A slow weakening of its core systems was followed by a sharp collapse. It was a death not by one blow, but by 1,000 small failures accumulating into something the city could no longer recover from. But it wasn't just the environment that failed. Social and political fractures deepened during this period as well. The archaeological contrast between elite and commoner burials is striking. High-status tombs like that of CPM 13 were filled with jade ornaments, fine ceramics, and symbolic grave goods, suggesting a life of privilege and power. In contrast, the majority of the population was buried in far simpler graves, often with no offerings at all. This points to a society where inequality was growing more visible and possibly more resented. The DNA evidence also adds a new layer to this divide. While individuals like CPM 13 were likely members of a ruling class with elite ancestry, others like CPM 12, who was buried in a sacrificial pose, may have belonged to lower status groups, used in rituals to reinforce the authority of the elite or to symbolically appease the gods in times of crisis. Was this inequality sustainable, or did it fuel unrest at the worst possible moment? One theory suggests that the people who supported the state, farmers, laborers, artisans, may have eventually lost faith in the leadership. As resources became scarce and the city's elite continued to extract labor and tribute, the lower classes may have begun to resist or simply walk away. There is some archaeological evidence of buildings being left unfinished, sites being abandoned mid-use, and rural settlements being depopulated. In a system built on shared ritual, labor, and belief, even passive withdrawal could be devastating. At the same time, Copan was not immune to external threats. Rival city-states like Tikal, Calakmul, and especially Quirigua, located nearby, were part of a constantly shifting political landscape. Alliances were made and broken. Battles were fought over trade routes and prestige. Copan's once dominant position was challenged, and by the 8th century, it was no longer clear that the ruling dynasty could maintain order or defend the city's interests. When political alliances fractured and diplomatic ties failed, so too did the legitimacy of Copan's leaders. Another factor that accelerated the decline was the loss of centralized leadership. Once the dynasty ended, there was no strong institutional framework left to guide the city. Maya political authority was deeply tied to specific bloodlines, divine legitimacy, and ritual performance. Without a king, the entire structure began to unravel. The final generations of Copan's inhabitants likely lived in a city where old power symbols still stood, but the leadership behind them was gone. Temples remained, but priests had no backing. Palaces still stood, but were empty. People probably remained in the area for years afterward. But Copan was no longer a functioning political or cultural capital. What makes this collapse so uniquely traceable is how perfectly the archaeological and genetic timelines now align. DNA evidence shows a sharp drop in population diversity and growth after 750, right as Copan begins to fall. Genetic bottlenecks, reduced mobility, and the disappearance of certain lineages all point to a biological reflection of political failure. We're not just seeing ruins, we're seeing lives that ended or moved on, families that disappeared, bloodlines that stopped contributing to the gene pool. The people didn't vanish entirely, but the system they built and the world they ruled did. So what exactly caused Copan to fall? There is no single answer. It wasn't just drought. It wasn't just inequality. It wasn't just political collapse. It was a chain reaction. One vulnerability triggering another, each making the next more severe. A stressed environment couldn't support a booming population. A fractured society couldn't adapt quickly enough. A weakened political structure couldn't maintain unity. And in the end, the civilization that once stood as a symbol of Maya brilliance simply ran out of ways to hold itself together. But even in collapse, the clues they left behind, etched in stone, buried in soil, and sealed in DNA, are finally telling the full story. What DNA can't show. Ancient DNA can tell us a lot. Who people were related to, where they might have come from, when their population grew, and when it began to decline. But for all its precision, DNA can't tell us what it felt like to watch your world unravel. It doesn't explain what it meant to live through the final days of Copan, not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. It can't measure fear, or devotion, or loss. So while science gives us the outline of collapse, it's still up to us to ask the harder question. How did the Maya themselves understand what was happening? Was the disappearance of rain seen as a punishment from the gods? Were failed crops understood not just as natural disasters, but as signs of spiritual imbalance, or warnings from ancestors? Maya religion didn't separate the natural world from the divine. Weather, soil, animals, and people were all part of the same cosmic system. If that system broke down, the response wasn't just logistical, it was ritual. So what did the Maya do when their prayers stopped working? When the rains didn't come, did they interpret it as a loss of favor or as a challenge that required more sacrifice? Was CPM-12's burial not just a reflection of hierarchy or punishment, but a sacred offering, a last desperate attempt to restore order? There are hints in the archaeological record that rituals intensified in Copan's final years. More offerings were made. More individuals were buried in positions suggesting sacrifice. These responses weren't random acts of violence. They were deeply structured actions tied to belief systems that saw the world as a balance between forces. When that balance began to slip, people didn't just watch. They acted, with whatever tools their culture had given them. Some might have stayed and continued the ceremonies. Others might have left, carrying their traditions to new places. Migration wasn't just survival. It was also a cultural response to collapse. And that brings us to another important truth. Copan did not vanish. It was depopulated, yes. Its ruling system ended. Its monuments fell into silence. But its people didn't disappear. They moved, they adapted. And we know this not only from archaeology, but from genetics. The same Y chromosome lineage, Q1b, that was found in Copan's elite tombs still appears today in millions of Maya men across Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. The mitochondrial haplogroups, A2 and C1, passed from mothers to children, also remain widespread. These are not symbolic connections. They are literal biological continuities that link the classic Maya to living communities today. So what does that mean for how we tell the story of collapse? It means we need to be careful. Collapse doesn't always mean extinction. It often means transformation. The end of a dynasty is not the end of a people. The fall of a city does not erase its culture, its language, or its memory. The narrative of total disappearance is something we've imposed from the outside. But DNA pushes back against that. It shows survival, not always in the same place or in the same form, but survival nonetheless. And if we rethink Copan this way, what might that mean for other so-called lost civilizations? What if the ruins we associate with disappearance are actually just traces of movement, adaptation, and persistence? The deeper we go into the science, the more we're forced to revise not just what we know, but how we understand the past. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.